What I like to do on Good Friday is look at our Passion Gospel from John. We don't often get to preach a lot about John's Gospel and the story of Jesus' death in John's Gospel. Today's the day. So, not a usual sermon, not a usual flow of preaching. I'm going to read it and comment. My goal in doing this is filling in a lot of what's between the lines and the backstory for you all so you can have a better understanding of what's happening in these final hours of Jesus's life. So up to this point, our reading today is from John 19. You have it in your bulletin. If you open it up, that's what's there on the inside of your bulletin, or if you have your own Bibles, it's John chapter 19. Up to this point, we had the events of last night, the Last Supper. The disciples move to the Garden of Gethsemane where they think it's going to be a normal time of prayer. Jesus is betrayed by Judas. He's arrested. He's taken before the Sanhedrin, which is their council, the religious council that weighs in on religious matters. And then he's taken to the high priest. And the high priest, convinced that he's a blasphemer, sends him to Pilate because he wants Pilate to condemn him to death. We'll get into that a little bit more in just a moment. But Pilate meets with him and finds him to be innocent. The Pharisees and the religious leaders are pushing for his death. Pilate, he's been on the job at this time about 5 years. He's been governor of Judea. So Pilate has had a few cases before him, and Pilate feels he's innocent. So Pilate tries to reach a settlement, and that's where our chapter begins, with Pilate taking Jesus and having him flogged. The goal of this is to try to meet in the middle. Right? Pilate feels he's innocent. The Pharisees want him dead. If Pilate just beats him up really bad, maybe they'll be happy. And Pilate doesn't have to kill an innocent man, and the Pharisees can go home without complaining. So they flogged Jesus. Now, Roman flogging was no small matter. It was pretty brutal. Everything the Romans did was brutal because Rome ruled with this idea. This is going to come up again when we talk about crucifixion. I want your punishment to be so bad, so scarring, that you will never break the law again. That's how Rome ruled. Fear of punishment. So when they flogged Jesus, they didn't just kind of hit him a little. It was 39 lashes with a Roman whip, which was a cord that had 3 tails on it. So you think like, one cord that the centurion would hold, but then the end of it had 3 tails, and they would put pieces of bone and metal in there. They would knot it and put the bone and the metal in there. The idea was they wanted to damage the muscles underneath the flesh in your back. So they wanted to go beneath the skin. So this is not just light punishment that Jesus is getting. This is brutal. And so Pilate has him flogged. And the soldiers continue to mock him. And they put a crown of thorns on him and a purple robe. Purple's a royal color. And they keep coming up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him on the face. The soldiers aren't really, we don't know, the soldiers aren't really doing this for religious reasons. Right? The soldiers are soldiers. They work for Caesar. Caesar is the King of the Jews. That's one of his titles. At one point, he gave it to King Herod the Great, the king that was alive when Jesus was born, but he took it back because he didn't like Herod's sons. And so Caesar's the King of the Jews. So for the soldiers, it's not really a religious mockery. It's more of a Roman pride. Like, how dare this guy, this preacher from this place no one cares about, this religion that's weird and odd, how dare he claim to be king in the great Roman Empire? So for the soldiers, it's mockery about the greatness of Rome they're upholding. It's not really a religious thing for the soldiers. It is for the priests and the Jewish people, but not for the soldiers. So Jesus has been whipped. He's been beaten. He's humiliated, obviously. He's got a crown of thorns. They put a purple robe on him. He's bloody. He's humiliated. And Pilate brings him out. And he says, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." Here's Pilate's hope. A compassionate person is going to see this man beaten severely and humiliated, and they're going to say, okay, he's had enough. This is what Pilate's hope is. So he brings Jesus out, humiliated and beaten, hoping that the compassion of the Jewish leaders is going to say, all right, let's all go home. But that's not what they say. When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." Now, Pilate is not someone who is a great person of integrity. You know, Pilate doesn't want to kill an innocent man, but he's okay with beating an innocent man within an inch of his life. And he's okay with kind of mob rule here. When Pilate says, yeah, take him yourself and crucify him, just figure it out, right? We're not going to send the FBI. If something happens to this guy, right, we're not going to send our troops in to investigate. Just go handle it yourselves. And we know there's cases, we see him in the gospel all the time when Jesus stumbles upon or gets put in the middle of a person about to be stoned, right? There's a woman caught in adultery. They were about to stone her, mob justice. And that happened. And Pilate says, just go do it. I don't want to do it. Right? You all go do it. But the Jewish leaders don't want to do it either. It's really important that Rome does it. So then the Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to the law, he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God." Now, when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. I don't know if Pilate's a religious man. You don't really get that. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But like the Roman world had these ideas of like kind of gods, right? Hercules and people like that who were like part divine. So we don't know what Pilate's thinking here. There's something different about Jesus. He picks up on that much of it. But we're not sure if Pilate is having a religious moment or if Pilate just really feels he's innocent. Maybe there's something to him. I don't want to be the one to put him to death. So Pilate brings Jesus into his headquarters and he asks him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." This is Jesus referencing the high priest, or all the priests and the leaders, because they should know better, right? Pilate's just administrator. He's caught up in this, right? He's the government in this. The religious leaders should have known better. They knew the prophecies, they knew the scriptures, they knew all this. They orchestrated this. And Jesus says, you know, you're just here in this spot because of circumstance. The one who brought me here, the high priest who brought him to Pilate, my own people, it's the greater sin. This is a hard saying for us sometimes. I find it challenging in my own life. You know, Jesus understands, even in this moment, right? Jesus understands all authority is the Father's authority, all of it. And even though he's under Pilate's authority in this moment, he says it's only because the Father's letting it happen for a time. And there are times in our life when we find ourselves under authority that we don't want to be under, right? Whether it's work, life, whatever. We find ourselves in positions where we're under authority we don't want to be under. And it's hard for us to remember that all authority is the Father's authority, and he's never given that up. There's just times and seasons where we may be under authority that we don't like. And Jesus is recognizing that even in the midst of his own trial and crucifixion. He says, you don't have any authority over me unless the Father gave it to you for a time. From then on, Pilate tried to release him. There's something about Jesus Pilate just is drawn to. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. Now, if you're not familiar with this reading, it doesn't have a sarcasm font, but that is as sarcastic of a line as anyone could ever yell in this story. No one in the Jewish world loves the emperor. That's like saying, hey, raise our taxes. We love paying taxes. Nobody is for the emperor, but they're making a case. They want Rome to kill Jesus. If the Jewish leaders just stone Jesus, the people that love Jesus as a prophet, their anger is going to get turned on them. If Jesus is crucified, which is a very violent symbol of Roman rule, then all the anger of Jesus' followers goes on Rome, and the chief priests just slide out of the equation, which is what they're trying to do. So they say the thing to Pilate that they think is going to move Pilate. We have the emperor. The emperor is the king. If you say he's innocent, how could you say you're a friend of the emperor? Now, I don't know what Pilate's career aspirations were, but doubtful that he wanted to be the governor of Judea for his whole life. It wasn't a glamorous job. It was a hard job. And Judea would have a different governor every 4 or 5 years because it was just a challenging job. It was very far from Rome. The people were different. They were rebellious. They rejected Roman rule, and there was a lot of problems. So the thought, you would assume, was that Pilate would someday want a little better job. Maybe Florence, Milan, Athens, right? Somewhere on the coast. But you're not going to get that promotion if somewhere in your file it says you were okay with treason. So they know that's the thing to get Pilate on. When they say everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor, Pilate doesn't want to kill Jesus to a point, to the point where it affects his career. Now it's him or me. And Pilate's going to make a choice. So it says, when Pilate heard these words, everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on a judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. That was a part of Pilate's home where the official judgments would be rendered. So it's like in our world, right? The judge sitting at the bench, gavel in hand, ready to pronounce. Right, this is formal now. It was the day of preparation for the Passover, the day before Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." Now they cried out, away with him, crucify him." And Pilate asked them, and Pilate's trying to needle them now, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." And then he handed him over to them to be crucified. Pilate's willing to spare him up to a point, but not enough to affect him. But he makes them yell out their love and support for the emperor just because he wants to annoy them as much as possible during this interaction. So they took Jesus, carrying the cross by himself. He went out to what was the place called the place of the skull, or in the Hebrew, it's called Golgotha. Golgotha is a hill outside the city of Jerusalem. It kind of looked like a skull. At least, or thought it looked like a skull back in the day. It had these indents in the top that looked like, the hollow eyes of a skull. And so they called it the place of a skull, but it's fitting, right? Because that's where executions were done. And the Romans loved to execute people right outside the city. They would not have been fans of modern day Chamber of Commerce ideas. The Romans liked this. We try to make our cities look so attractive. When you come in, welcome to Harlingen, and we have nice, greenery around it. Every city has things like that. In the Roman world, they had a different idea. They wanted their execution place right at the entrance to the city. And the idea was this: when you come in this city, this is what happens if you break the law. Rome ruled by fear. It was how they were able to handle such a large empire. It's not because they had the manpower or the army to do it. It was because they ruled by that fear. So when you walked into Jerusalem, you would see these men hanging on a cross, and you would understand if I get out of line while I'm here, if I cross Rome, if I misbehave, this is what happens. That's what Rome wanted everyone to know entering the city. So they take Jesus there to the execution place. And there they crucified him, and with him two other thieves we know from the other Gospels, one on either side with Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Now, everybody who was crucified would get their crime put above them on the cross, right? This adds to the intimidation of people walking in. So you might see somebody there, he stole a car. They didn't have cars back then, but you get the idea, right? He stole, right? Robbery, treason, right? Whatever the crime was, they would hang it above the person. So you would know when you walked in that city, this is what happens to people who do this. And so Pilate, instead of putting treason, or which would have been the official crime Jesus was convicted of, he puts Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, because he wants to take this opportunity to mock the leaders and the people that brought him there. This is what Rome does to the King of the Jews. Now, many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Pilate wrote it in 3 languages so everybody could read it. Hebrew was the language for the religious leaders. Latin was the Roman administrative language, and Greek was the everyday language. And then the chief priest of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" And Pilate answers, "What I have written, I have written." Right? He's going to mock them. If he's going to crucify this man that he didn't want to crucify, he's going to mock the whole people while he does it. Now, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now, the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. John includes this one because it fulfills the prophecy, but also to say Jesus had a nice tunic. Most people didn't have a seamless tunic woven from the top. Most people would have tunics that would be patched or would be sewn in 2 pieces put together because it was cheaper to patch fabric and put fabric together than it was to get large quantities of fabric. But priests were required to wear seamless tunics. Priests had to have one fabric seamless. Somebody gave Jesus a really nice tunic, right? And it's kind of as a symbol of his role. They saw him as a priestly figure. Someone gave Jesus a really nice tunic. And they had the soldiers say, "Let's not tear it. Let's not break up the fabric and just break it up into 4 so we can use it to patch things in our house. Somebody should get the whole thing because they didn't want to tear it." It was a very expensive piece of clothing. And John said this was to fulfill what the scriptures say. This is from Psalm 22 that we read last night. "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." And that is what the soldiers did. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Now, you might wonder in this, how are certain people able to get near the cross and others aren't? Well, one, the disciples ran away, with the exception of one, the disciple Jesus loved, John, who we're going to hear about in just a second. So the disciples aren't even an option now because they're all hiding. But generally, the Roman guards would not let men or groups of men near the cross, because the idea was if this person had a loyal following or a large family, right, a group of 5 guys might be able to try to get him down. Women were not considered in those days to be a threat to do that. So women were allowed to come closer, whereas the men were kept at bay. So John mentions 4 women that were there. One is his mother, in what has to be the most heartbreaking moment of her life. His mother's sister, Jesus' aunt, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and of course, Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, we take that to be John, standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. You know, even on the cross, Jesus is thinking of other people. And there's something he has to do on the cross, make sure his mother's taken care of. I can't tell you how many people I've been with in their last days that are not afraid of dying, but want to make sure the people they love are taken care of here. It's the thing that holds them. And you can see the humanity of Jesus here. This is his mother. We assume that Joseph has passed, right? Or it wouldn't be a no-brainer. Joseph would take her home, but his mother's a widow, and he wants to make sure that she's taken care of. And he gives that honor to his beloved disciple, John. And it says, John, from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. This, in a weird way, right? The cross creates a new family. And it continues to through the church. The cross creates new relationships, new families. This is the best argument we have for Jesus not having biological brothers and sisters. I don't want to wade into that too much. I know we've talked about that in various studies around Christmas time. But if Jesus had other brothers, males, why wouldn't they take care of their mother? The fact that he gives John the charge of taking care of her would lead us to believe that there aren't other adult males who can do that task. And so Jesus sees that his mother is cared for. It says something about the love he has for her. Jesus in his humanity, thinking about his mother, even in his own suffering. So after Jesus commends his mother to his beloved disciple, Jesus knew that all was now finished. He said, in order to fulfill the scripture, I am thirsty. And a jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. Now, Jesus hasn't drank any of the wine yet to this point. There's a reason for this. The wine that they would have for criminals is the one kind of bit of humanity that the Romans would show in crucifying someone. It was a sedative of sorts. So think about, when we have loved ones near the end, morphine, and the effect that has kind of just makes them go to sleep. And the wine would be mixed with some places say gall, and some places say even gall and myrrh. And it would be kind of a concoction, like an anesthesia, a narcotic. It would help numb the pain. And once they would take it, someone in Jesus' condition would probably fade to sleep. And Jesus didn't want to take it yet because there were things he wanted to do on the cross that he wanted to be lucid for. John only tells us one of them. We get some in the other Gospels that Jesus pronounced forgiveness, that Jesus talked to the good thief. In John's Gospel, he wants us to know that before he did any of that, before he took the sedative himself, kind of go to sleep, he wanted to make sure his mother was taken care of. Right? That's such a human moment in Jesus' life. He's got to make sure she's okay before he closes his eyes. So Jesus takes the drink then. They put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." And most likely because he was barely hanging on at this point, he knew once he took that, his eyes were going to close and they weren't going to reopen. And he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. Now we get drawn back into the politics right away. Since it was the day of preparation, the Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, especially because that Sabbath was a great day of great solemnity. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken and the bodies removed. Okay, remember that thing we talked about where Rome liked people to see as they entered the city? Well, the day that was following was Passover, and thousands upon thousands of pilgrims were going to enter Jerusalem to make their sacrifice for Passover, and that was the last thing the Jewish people wanted them to see as they were entering the city. So as the day was going on, they asked the Romans if they could speed it up. And the way the Romans would do this is they would break the legs of the people on the cross. because the way the Romans positioned people on the cross to breathe, to take a breath, you had to push with your legs. You had to kind of step into your breath. And if your legs were broken, it would just be a matter of minutes before you couldn't breathe anymore and would die. It was a quick end to this. So they did that. They asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken. The soldiers came, they broke the legs of the two thieves, but Jesus, they saw he was already dead. So they pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. Now the Roman soldiers, Jesus is up on a cross, and he looks dead. They're not going to go up and check his pulse. They're not going to get up there and look. The Romans knew what they were doing because they did this type of thing all the time. So they knew if they stabbed him below the heart, if he was dead, out would come what came, blood and water. Now, the reason for that is, one, Jesus, I'm not a doctor. You can Google this. There's lots of medical terminology on what happened in Jesus. I'm going to give the short summary. Jesus had a lot of internal bleeding, and when his heart stopped beating, his blood began to separate. Right? So when your blood separates, the red blood cells are the heavier part, and the watery part of your blood is the lighter part. So it kind of separates like oil and water when it's not beating. And so when they knew stabbing under the heart, that's the way to check if he died. And because they stabbed underneath, the heavier red blood cells came out first, and then the lighter watery part came out second. So that was a witness to them that he had truly died. They did not need to break his legs. John sees it, and he wants people to know. He says, "He who saw this has testified so that you may also believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth." There's two reasons that John includes this. One is he wants people to know he saw Jesus die with his own eyes. Right? The eyewitness accounts were so important. And there were people, after Jesus rose and the disciples would say, "Jesus is alive," they would say, "Okay, maybe he's alive, but he really didn't die. He just got beat up really bad, and he went in the tomb where he healed, and then he came back out." And there were people who said that. And John wants people to know, I saw him die with my own eyes. I saw him. The other is that more symbolic, right? Water and wine are kind of, in the Old Testament, symbols of divinity, wine, and humanity, water. We see both come out from Jesus. There's a beautiful symbolism there. It's why when we pour the chalice on Sunday mornings, we'll do it on Easter morning, we mix water and wine in the chalice, right? It's kind of putting it back together, the humanity and the divinity of Jesus, honoring that. These things occurred so that the scripture might be fulfilled. John's going to fulfill some Old Testament scriptures here, that none of his bones shall be broken. They wouldn't break his bones. That's from Psalm 34. And again, another passage of scripture says, they will look on the one whom they have pierced. And that's Zechariah 12. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one because of fear of the Jews, asked Pilate to let him take away the body of Jesus. Pilate gave him permission. So he came and removed his body. Nicodemus, who had first come to Jesus by night, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes weighing about 100 pounds. So these are two Pharisees who were sympathetic to Jesus, but again, not enough that they were going to take a stand in public, but enough that afterwards, when the crowds weren't looking anymore, they could do right the best they could by giving Jesus a burial. Nicodemus brings a huge amount of spices. This burial would be like the equivalent of like a $50,000 funeral today. This is a royal burial. And so even though they weren't strong enough to stand up for Jesus under the scrutiny of the high priest and the council, they're trying to do right with it by him in his burial the best they can. Now, the women don't know this is going on. Jesus is being buried kind of as the sun is setting on the day before the Sabbath. So the Sabbath starts at sunset. So nobody's allowed to do burial work once the Sabbath begins. So Jesus' burial is a very rushed project. So the women and the people that love Jesus don't really know all this is going on. That's why in their head, they're going to come and do the burial Sunday morning as soon as the sun comes up, because they're going to do it right for Jesus, not aware that other people are doing it kind of in the rush of sunset. So they take the body of Jesus and they wrapped it in spices and linen cloths according to the burial custom of the Jews. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so because it was the Jewish day of preparation and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. And the story ends in a garden. It's kind of fitting, right? The first story of the Bible involving people and God happens in a garden. The first story of sin happens in a garden. This story ends in a garden. Sunday's story starts in a garden. It's kind of something fitting about the setting there. We know this isn't the end. We know there's more to the story. There's another part. We're going to do that on Easter morning. But it's important to remember this thing. The joy of Easter doesn't dull any of the pain of Good Friday. They don't know. They don't know. None of these people who watch this know what's coming. Mary watched her son die. She doesn't know about Easter. She suffered every second with him. So did Mary Magdalene. So did the people that loved him. Easter is real and it's true, but its joy doesn't take away from the pain of these moments. And I feel that's true in our life too. Right? The joy of Christ's victory does not take away from the pain of our Good Fridays. It just makes it look different on the other side. So if you are one of those people that's holding on in a Good Friday moment where you're struggling with that pain and that suffering, know that you're not alone. All of Jesus' followers felt the same thing you're feeling. And just because Jesus wins and God wins in the end doesn't take away the pain that you have. No, there is another side that helps it look different. Easter is coming. But sometimes we have to wait.